Awesome. Well, I want to welcome everyone today to Best Management Practices for Roadside Invasive Species, and thank you for taking the time out of your day to join us. I will be one of your speakers today. My name is Rebecca Bernacki. I'm the Terrestrial Invasive Species Coordinator at the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, and you'll learn a little bit more about our program here in a minute. Our other speaker today will be my colleague, Sean Kittle. Sean is our Invasive Species Communications Coordinator.
Hey, everyone.
And just a little trail map of where we're going today. So the first few minutes, we're in the midst of it now. It's just our introductions and overview. So welcome. Next, we'll kick things off and Sean will talk a little bit about what invasive species are. He'll give a little background about our program, and then he'll talk about the right-of-way and the impact invasive species have on the right-of-way and why it's really important to manage these species and tailor our management of the right-of-way to help control invasive species. Then Sean will pass the baton to me and we'll talk about invasive species ID and control techniques. So we'll first talk about what foliar sprays are, some actions we can take to protect our native pollinators, and then we'll get into species ID and species-specific control. Finally, we'll have the last 10 minutes for some final questions, some closing remarks. We'll take a few minutes to put in a shameless plugs for some upcoming events that we have, and then we'll all head out. And just a last reminder that today's webinar is being offered for pesticide credits. So that there are 1.5 credits available in categories 3A, 6A, 9, and 10. To receive those credits, you must view this entire webinar, including the Q&A. So when we get to the end, Sean will drop the link into chat. And then we'll proceed to our Q&A, and you're welcome to copy and paste that link while it's available. Sean will also be sending an email immediately after the webinar with the link to that quiz as well. The quiz is 10 questions. It must be completed in 10 business days, so it'll close at Saturday at 11 o'clock. You are allowed unlimited attempts at the quiz, but you must have a passing score of 70 to get the credits. The quiz will also ask you to input your pesticide ID number, so make sure you have your card handy. It will also ask for your mailing address. Please provide that mailing address, as that's the address we will mail your form to. So without further ado, I will pass the baton to Sean.
Good morning, everyone. As Becca mentioned, I am Sean Kittle. I am the Communications Coordinator for the Adirondack Park Invasive Plant Program, which I will refer to as APIP from here on out. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what APIP does, and then I'm going to give a general overview of invasive species and how invasive species can impact the right-of-way. So APIP was first established about 25 years ago. Since then, the effort has become statewide. And next slide, Becca. Yeah, there we go. Okay. So yeah, we were established about 25 years ago, and since then the effort has become statewide, and we are now part of a larger network of 8 PRISMs throughout the state. That's PRISM. It stands for Partnership for Regional Invasive Species Management. APIP is hosted by the Nature Conservancy, and we are funded by the Environmental Protection Fund, as administered by the State Department of Environmental Conservation. So APIP's goals include preventing new introductions of invasive species, rapidly detecting and eradicating new infestations, and then managing existing priority infestations to mitigate their impacts. These goals tie into transportation because our road corridors are often areas for invasive species introduction. As you can see on the right there, APIP has 3 main areas that support the goals. We have terrestrial invasive species programs, we have aquatic invasive species programs, and we have education and outreach programs, which is my world. That's what I spend a lot of time doing. And if you take a look at the map here, you can see the 8 PRISMs total. There's APIP there where the Adirondack Park is, and then we've got the other 7 around the state. So if you're calling in from somewhere else around the state and you have some specific questions about invasive species, if you're in Western New York or down there in the lower Hudson, definitely reach out to those respective PRISMs, and they should be able to help you more. You can always reach out to us as well, but it might be easier for you just to reach out to the ones that are local to you. Next slide, please. All right, so I'm going to start with education and outreach as I give a little background on APIP, because that's my world. This is where I spend a lot of my time. APIP has a number of educational materials that we use to inform the public on how to prevent the spread of invasive species. And, we host a lot of webinars like this one to educate the public on invasive species management and prevention. We've found that it's a lot easier to prevent invasive species from being spread than it is to deal with them once we're here. So you can see the top three are brochures that we have. They're little trifold brochures, and they give some information on specific species, and then it's a lot of information on how to prevent those species from spreading. The bottom two are posters, 11 by 17, I believe, is their dimensions. But they can be displayed, at various locations, visitor centers, and whatnot, to just remind people of some steps they can take to help us prevent invasive species from spreading. And then on the right there, we have our field guide to terrestrial invasive species of the Adirondack. So these are all free, and I think this field guide is really valuable. It covers 28 invasive species. Most of them are here in the park already. There's a couple that are kind of close that we want folks to keep an eye on that are included as well. And it's really a good sort of beginner's guide to how to identify plants, and then it gets into those 28 species. So that's a really handy guide to have, and it's completely free. So if you really want to look at getting into a little bit more about what these species look like and how to identify them, I'd recommend visiting our website and ordering a couple guides. Okay, next slide, please. So we also give away 2 free boot brush signs every year. You can see 2 examples right here. The one on the left is one we recently completed for the Adirondack Mountain Club's Cascade Welcome Center. And then actually I drove by yesterday and saw that it was installed. And then the one on the right is the one that we did for the Adirondack Lodge last year. So you can kind of see what it looks like once it's installed. The boot brush signs and the boot brush stations are really important. They're located around the park at various trailheads and parking areas, and they provide a simple, easy way for people to clean their boots off, before and after a hike. And this is important, and we're going to get into some of this a little bit later here, but this is important because invasive plant materials, including stems, leaves, and seeds, can easily be transported to new areas on people's hiking boots. So it's really important for folks to clean their boots before and after a hike, just to be extra careful that they're not inadvertently spreading something to a new area. So next slide, please. So for the aquatic side of things, we're going to talk a lot about terrestrial today, but I did want to make you aware of the aquatic program. We have Lake Protectors and Lake Management Tracker. They're 2 related but different programs. Lake Protectors, and you can see on the left here, that's our aquatic invasive species coordinator, Brian Green. He's giving a talk at Moody Pond here in Saranac Lake. It's more of a volunteer effort for individuals. So individuals basically attend a training to learn how to identify and report aquatic invasive species. The trainings are usually about 3 hours. Then they sign up online to monitor I'd say lake, but it's a water body, really. It could be a pond. And then they monitor the water body at least once between July and September. And most volunteers spend like 1 to 3 hours or so monitoring. And then they report their findings back to APIP. And, they can report something they find or something they don't find. If they're out there looking for certain species and they don't find them, it's really useful to know that as well. And then Lake Management Tracker, that is geared more toward communities or groups like lake associations. And it's for water bodies that are being managed for aquatic invasive species. You can see an example on the right here of a report from that's been using data gathered by Lake Management Tracker people. So basically, the local community or group commits to getting together a core group of volunteers to be trained, and then they participate in the program for 3 to a 5-year period, so they can track the trends of plant growth and assess the management effectiveness. They monitor the location at least once a year, and then they help review and provide input on the annual report. And on our end, APIP, we work with those organizations, we train them, we help set up the monitoring locations on the lake. We provide all the software to record the observations. We store and analyze the data that's collected, and then we write up that annual report. And there's 10 to a dozen or so lakes participating in this program right now. And you can see on the right there, it kind of shows over time, this is water milfoil abundance in this lake. I think it's Chateauguay Lake. All right, next slide, please. The forest pest hunters, they're kind of the land counterparts to our aquatic programs. Volunteers adopt a trail and they commit to monitoring it within a given time frame. In the winter, we train volunteers to look for hemlock woolly adelgid, and on the left here, you can see Becca training people. This is either last January or February, I forget which. And then in the summer, we train volunteers to look for beech leaf disease, which has been confirmed in Herkimer County here in the southern Adirondacks. And unfortunately, it's quite prevalent in other parts of the state and beyond. So this is really kind of cool. If you look on the right there, you can see a report. This season, volunteers adopted 73 trails and contributed 884 records to New York IMAP invasives. That's a for context, that's a really good number. We were really proud of that. Of these records, we had 212 confirmed findings, many of which helped delineate existing infestations. And then the remaining 672 were non-detects. And as I mentioned before, that's really useful for informing scientists, in this case of where HWA is not yet present. And volunteers contributed more than 325 hours, which is really impressive. So we're really proud of these programs. All right, next slide, please. All right, let's move on to invasive species. So why are some species invasive? On the right here, you're going to see 3 examples of different species. For a species to be considered invasive, it must satisfy the following. And when I say satisfy the following, I mean both. So first, it's not native to the region in question. It's often moved there by humans. Animals can transport these things, but we often find that humans are the main culprit, usually inadvertently, for transporting invasive species. And then 2, they cause harm to the environment, the economy, or public health. So on the right at the top, we have poison ivy. I don't know anyone who likes poison ivy. It's definitely a human health concern. If you've ever brushed up against it, as I have, you know that. But it is native to the region, so it's not an invasive species, even though it does cause harm to public health. Right below that, we have tomatoes. Tomatoes are not native to the US, but they don't present a problem regarding the environment, economy, or public health. People tend to like them, and then they're not an issue. So even though they are not native, they don't check that second box of causing harm. And then last, we have swallowwort. That's a swallowwort flower on the bottom. Swallowwort is part of the milkweed family, and then this is interesting. If you know anything about monarchs in particular, rely on milkweed to complete their life cycle. But unfortunately, butterflies don't know the difference between swallowwort and milkweed, and the problem is that swallowwort has chemicals that are harmful to the caterpillars. So here we have a species that is not native to the region, and it also causes some form of harm. In this case, it would be environmental to the butterflies. So that is an invasive species. Okay, next slide, please. Now, there's other characteristics of invasive species that are concerning as well. And unlike the previous slide, a species doesn't have to check all of these boxes to be considered invasive, but these are some really common characteristics that invasive species tend to have. So lacking predators and parasites, Japanese barberry, which is in the lower right-hand corner there, it's that red berry. It's a poor forage for animals in our area. It has really nasty thorns that animals don't really like to get close to. But for that reason, mice love to hide under it because they can hide under it and it's less likely something's going to get in there after them. More mice generally means more ticks, which can also generally mean more Lyme disease. So this is a good example of a plant that can kind of perpetuate another existing issue by its presence. Another thing they can do is produce many offspring or seeds. In the upper left there, we have purple loosestrife. It's also nicely labeled, and you can see all the seeds there on that piece of paper. One purple loosestrife plant can produce millions of seeds. So it's quite prolific. They can also reproduce by multiple means. Yellow iris to the right next to the purple loosestrife there. Yellow iris can reproduce by producing seeds or through these really fast growing rhizomes. So it has a couple ways in which to spread. A lot of invasive species are also generalists, which basically means they can handle a wide range of light, soil, moisture, temperature conditions. The example we have here is in the lower left. That sort of tropical looking plant is a tree of heaven. And it's an amazing generalist. It can grow in a wide range of conditions. And there's kind of a double whammy with the tree of heaven. It's not only a generalist, but it's also a host species of spotted lanternfly. If you're calling in from anywhere outside of the Adirondacks, you've probably heard of, and hopefully if you are from the Adirondacks, you've heard of it too. But spotted lanternfly is located throughout the state. It's caused a lot of damage to crops. People are definitely concerned by it. So this tree is something that spotted lanternfly likes. So if this is here and spotted lanternfly come, it's like they're happy, and that's not good for us. And then lastly, it's worth mentioning that they can also monopolize resources. We're going to see an example of that on the next slide. But once established, a lot of invasive species can form a monoculture and hog all of the resources for themselves, and making it really difficult for native species to coexist with them. The next slide, please. And if you could click this one more time, Becca, this one's on like yeah, there we go. That picture needs another click to show up. So here I just wanted to give you 3 examples of what I'm talking about when I say environment, public health, or economy. In the upper right, we have garlic mustard. And I promised you I'd give you an example of a monoculture. This is it. Garlic mustard has chemicals that prevent other plants from growing around them. And these chemicals kill the soil fungus that trees need. They also form a monoculture, as you can see here. They're just covering that forest floor, which basically means there's no biodiversity there. Anything native is going to have a really tough time growing among all that garlic mustard. And then public health, wild parsnips on the lower left, you can see some really nasty rash/burns/blisters on that guy's arms. Wild parsnip and giant hogweed are 2 invasive plants that can produce chemical burns like the ones in the photo here. And then on the right, we're going to be getting more into this. That's Japanese knotweed. And as you can see here, it is completely taking over that roadside. It's consuming signs, guardrails, right of way. If a car needs to pull over there, it's going to have a really tough time doing so. This is a huge problem to transportation professionals who have to spend a lot of time and money keeping it at bay. So it's a good example of an invasive species having a negative impact on the economy. All right, next slide, please. All right, now we're going to get into invasive species and the right of way. Go ahead and flick to the next slide there. So why should people care about invasive species? Well, as I've gotten into before here, they cause some kind of harm, right? They cause some kind of harm that in general people don't want. These negative impacts can impact road work. They can impact maintenance and construction. And if we ignore them, they can make a job a lot more difficult and be quite costly, and in some cases even dangerous. Next slide, please. So invasive species can grow quickly. Many invasive species can grow, some of them up to 2 feet in a couple of weeks. It's really hard to keep up with how fast these things can grow. So right here we have sort of a marshy wetland kind of area. And Becca, if you give it a click, you'll see this is like a before and after here. That's what it looked like after Phragmites became established in the area. So Phragmites, I think we're going to talk about that a little bit later, but it can reach up to 15 feet in height. And it grows so densely that nothing else can grow underneath it. It's a couple weeks ago, I was actually down in the Lake George region, and I saw a patch of Phragmites next to a beach, and it was really imposing. I was standing right next to it. I'm about 6 feet tall. This stuff was easily twice my height. And I mean, it's just a wall of vegetation. If you look underneath it in the stalks, it's dark. There's nothing but dirt there. Nothing is growing underneath it. It was really striking to me when I saw that. I was like, wow, this is serious. Next slide, please. So here we have some block signage. You have these species that can grow rapidly, and as I just mentioned, some of them can get as tall as 15 feet. So that's bad enough when we're talking about a wild area, but when you have these species growing alongside the road, like in the photo here, as Japanese knotweed, it can easily block signs and cover guardrails, and it can also block lines of sights for drivers. And all of this is hazardous. Here it's blocking a kind of a twisty road warning sign. And give that another week or two, and it's totally going to be covering that sign. All right, next slide, please. So because of everything we've mentioned, increased maintenance needs are required when you're dealing with proliferation of invasive species. So again, we have Japanese knotweed. Because it grows so quickly, it can get so tall and it's so dense, it increases the need for maintenance. When you get a species that can grow a foot in a week, it doesn't take long after it's cut for it to become a problem again. As you can see in this image, the shoulder of the road is, again, it's being consumed by the invasive knotweed. If that red car had an emergency and need to pull over, there's very little room to do so. And it's pretty safe to say this stuff will soon begin encroaching onto the roadway if it's left unchecked. It's really close to that white line there. The next slide, please. So these species also cause damage to infrastructure. And a lot of these species are quite tenacious. They can grow through 3 inches of asphalt or concrete. And of course, this is going to damage the infrastructure. It's going to cause those cracks to widen, and it's reducing the longevity of the infrastructure. So it's going to require more maintenance, and at the end, it's going to cost more money. Okay, next slide, please. So invasives can also increase the cost of construction. Studies have shown that the presence of knotweed on a construction site can add 10% to the cost of development. So thinking about prevention can really save costs down the line on various projects. So next slide. And again, we have human health, and if you forgot, there is a good example of what that looks like. So not only do these species have negative impacts on roadways and affect, things like the economy and workers being stretched thin, they can also affect human health. You might recognize the species in the background here. It's wild parsnip, and wild parsnip has a sap that, if it gets on your skin, and then the sap that's on your skin is exposed to sunlight, it can cause these severe blisters and burning, and it can leave really nasty scars. And we've heard some stories about the scars it leaves. It's pretty bad. And this is a particularly bad species to hit with a weed eater or a mower because, especially without any protective gear, because of that sap. Once you start cutting it, that sap goes flying, and you don't want to be anywhere near it. So next slide, please. Now, lastly, I'm going to get into reducing invasive species spread through road construction and maintenance. What are some of the ways that invasive species are spread, and how can we reduce that impact? That is the question. So here we have soil disturbance and stabilization. A major way invasive species are spread, or can be spread, I should say, is through excavation. The excavation process can open up the seed bank, exposing a layer of invasive seeds that might not have otherwise grown up through the top layer. A lot of invasives are also early colonizers, which means they can quickly take over an exposed or disturbed area like this before native species have a chance to take root. So it's best to avoid soil disturbance as much as possible, but of course it does happen. Sometimes it needs to. So if you do disturb the soil, try to stabilize it quickly. And if you're using fill, don't bring fill from an area where invasives are known to be. Next slide, please. So we're thinking about moving and maintaining equipment. Where equipment is stored can have a really big impact on whether or not an invasive species is spread. This staging area here in this photo is full of knotweed. It's growing over those plows. If someone moves one of those plows, they could easily end up moving a part of that plant material as well. And as I mentioned with the boot brush stations, some of these species, that's all it takes is a little piece of root or leaf or stem, and bam, you've got a new plant and a new infestation. So it's always best to use staging areas that are free from invasive plants. When moving equipment, always be sure to remove any visible soil and plant material from the equipment, and be sure to check tire treads. Much like boot treads, material can be removed using water or high pressured air. Or if it's a small piece of equipment, hand tools or a brush can be used. This is especially important if invasives are known to be in the area. As is the case here, it's pretty obvious. Next slide, please. Mowing can also be a huge vector of spread. And we have 3 species that'll be covered today that can be spread via stem fragments: purple loosestrife, common reedgrass, which is also known as Phragmites, and knotweed. Small pieces of these stems can grow roots and further spread the plant. Mowing these species should be avoided, but that said, mowing can also be a good tool for suppressing seed dispersal. Mowing before plants go to seed around August can actually help to mitigate the spread of some of these plants. With moving mowing equipment should be cleaned prior to moving the equipment to a new location. But at the very least, it should be cleaned daily to help mitigate the spread. It's just a good safeguard to be in a habit of cleaning this equipment daily. Next slide, please. And here we have a bunch of black plastic bags. If you do remove plants from a site, What should you do with them? Well, the plants in this image have been packed into thick contractor bags so they can be solarized. Solarizing means that the plants are bagged up and they're left in the sun for a few weeks. They get really hot and the plants liquefy, at which point they can be brought to a landfill. So once those plants are a gooey mess, you can actually dispose of them in a landfill. If you are dealing with woody shrubs, trees, or vines, anything like that, things that don't have any seeds, you can form brush piles with them. Okay, next slide, please. And last, we have contaminated fill. So going back to excavating, what do you do if fill is contaminated? If you remove material from a site, it should be stockpiled on an impervious surface, and you can monitor it to see if any invasive species pop up. In this photo, you can see knotweed is coming up in the fill. If plants like this do show up, you can render those plants non-viable through the methods that I just mentioned, like solaring, or you can use, people often use herbicides as well. You should also avoid excavating areas that have knotweed, purple loosestrife, or common reedgrass as they spread. Again, not only through stem fragments, but also through root fragments. So it's really, really easy to transport it. And next slide. Right. Thank you, everyone, and I'll pass it on to Becca.
Thanks, Sean, for that great background. So now we'll talk about invasive species identification and some control techniques. But before we get into that, I would be remiss if I gave any invasive species management talk and did not first talk about integrated pest management. Integrated pest management is an effective and environmentally sensitive approach to pest management that relies on a combination of common sense practices. Sorry, folks, apparently I'm bad at reading. So as you can tell, I read that slide word for word, but what does that really mean? It just means that those last three words, common sense practices. We're going to do what makes sense. If what we're doing is not working, we're going to try something else. And this is a cycle. So the first step is going to be scouting. So we're going to go out to our area where we're going to work and we're going to see if we see any invasive species. The next thing we'll do is identification. So a lot of invasive species have common lookalikes. And for the species we're going to talk about today, I'll talk about some of those lookalikes. We want to be sure that we're correctly identifying that species. And then we want to research its biology. Sean talked a little bit about mowing and how mowing can either be our best friend and help us with management or can be our worst enemy and make it worse. And a lot of that depends on the timing of when that plant goes to seed. So that's a great example of researching the biology of the plant to determine when's the best time to do our treatment. Our next step would be assessment. So we want to determine all available management options available to us. So oftentimes there may be a mechanical option as well as a chemical option, and we're going to have to decide which option is best for us and the site that we're looking at. Finally, we're going to go ahead and implement that best management practice option. We're going to do that at the optimal time of year based on the biology of the plant. Remember, we did that identification step and we researched that biology and under the appropriate conditions. So what does that mean? That really focuses on our herbicide work in particular. We don't want to go spray herbicide on a high wind or a rainy day. And I'll talk a little bit about that as we get further into this. Finally, evaluate. Remember, I said this is a cycle. So we're going to go back the next year or a few months later and see if it worked. Maybe we had a really big site of purple loosestrife and we decided our best management option was to use an herbicide. And we come back the next year and there's only a few plants left. Maybe then we switch to a mechanical treatment and just dig out those few plants. Or maybe the counter happened. We tried a mechanical treatment option, we come back the next year and it doesn't look like anything's worked. So maybe this year we want to try an herbicide option. We also want to have a site management plan. So any strong invasive species management plan is based on realistic goals and well-defined outcomes. So the first thing we want to do is be realistic. A lot of these invasive species have seeds that will persist in the seed bank for a while. So because of that, just because of the characteristics of a lot of these species, invasive species management is never going to be one and done. We can greatly reduce the population of invasive species with 1 year of treatment, but very, very often, almost always in fact, follow-up treatments are going to be required. So when we get into this, we need to know that it's going to take us a few years to really meet our objective of getting rid of these plants. So as a part of a site management plan, we want to ask ourselves the 4 questions, that any great reporter, and Sean was a reporter before he came to us, knows. The first is who. So what species is going to be a target species for management? What are we trying to eradicate from that site? The next will be what. So what management tools do we want to use? Do we want to use mechanical treatment or chemical treatment? Or is it one of those really cool species where a biological control is available? So when? When is the target species most vulnerable to the type of management we're planning to do? And when does it go to seed? Those are both important questions to ask as we plan our management. And finally, where? Where will our management take place and at what scale? So I'm going to shift gears now that we've kind of done a bit of our homework and talk a little bit about some general chemical best management practices. So as I talk through each species here in a little bit, we're going to talk about the best way to manage those species, both mechanically and chemically. And because I am talking through chemical treatment options, I do want to talk about some just general best management practices. The first, before doing any type of chemical treatment, is to know your limits. So if you are a non-certified applicator, so if you're Joe homeowner, you can only apply herbicides on property that you own. So if there's a patch of knotweed and it's both on your property and your neighbor Bill's property, you can only spray that knotweed that's on your property. If Bill comes out and gives you permission to spray on his property, you can't go over there. Bill has to spray his own, or he needs to hire a certified chemical applicator to do that work. Next, we always want to wear our appropriate PPE. PPE is listed on the product label, so if you're ever curious about what the appropriate PPE is for the product that you're using, look at the label. And the label is the law in New York State, so you are required to wear the appropriate PPE while applying pesticides. We want to be mindful of environmental conditions. Is it going to rain soon? Maybe not the best day to apply herbicide. Is it dewy? Maybe we need to wait. Is it windy? We'll need to adjust our droplet size. And also, we should probably take, the temperature into consideration as well if we're working with a product that volatilizes. We want to be sure that if we're working near water, we're using appropriately aquatically labeled products. We want to choose an appropriate product and application method for our target species. So a lot of the target species that we're going to be talking about today can be effectively controlled with glyphosate, triclopirimate, Zapir-based herbicides, but always check that product label. You also want to check the product label for the recommended dilution rate so that you're applying the appropriate amount or rate of product for that plant that you're treating. And finally, and probably most importantly, is be patient. These herbicides that we're going to talk about are systemic herbicides. So they don't kill the plant just where they touch it. They actually get absorbed into that plant tissue and translocated down to the roots. Because of that, it can take 2 to 3 weeks sometimes for us to see visual signs of decline. So if you treat your plants and you come out the next weekend and it's still looking healthy, don't despair. It just takes some time for that herbicide to get down and do its job. We also want to be mindful of our native plants and pollinators when we're working with herbicides. So the first step in that is practicing early detection and rapid response. So if we find an infestation while it's small, we're going to use a lot less herbicide to treat that infestation had we found it later and it had gotten a lot bigger. It also protects that habitat for native plants. By not allowing that monoculture to get big, we're allowing native plants to thrive on the outskirts of that infestation. Secondly, it's really, really important to keep records so that we can evaluate the effectiveness of our pest treatments and practice IPM. So if you went out and treated some knotweed on your property, you didn't make note of what herbicide you used or what the rate you used, if you saw great success, you're probably going to want to use that same treatment method. So it's great to have those notes. The same thing goes, maybe you didn't see great treatment and you've disposed of that herbicide, you've used it all up. Maybe you want to try a different product the next year. When possible, we want to use selective herbicides. If we're targeting a graminoid or a grass, maybe we want to use a grass-specific herbicide instead of a general use herbicide. And I've already touched on this, but we always want to properly time our applications for maximum effectiveness. So we did our IPM research and we figured out when the plant's most vulnerable to that herbicide and when it has maximum control. We also want to avoid using herbicides in non-ideal weather, as I already talked about. We can protect non-target plants by using more selective application methods. So maybe we want to get out and use backpack sprayers instead of boom sprayers if we only have a small population of something. We also want to control our drift by taking into account both weather and droplet size. We also want to ensure, especially if you're using big boom sprayers, that our equipment is properly calibrated so we know how much herbicide that we're using, so we stay within the labeled rate of that herbicide. This helps us avoid the overuse of herbicide, which can lead to herbicide resistance in plants. And finally, we want to recognize sensitive habitats. So be mindful if you're working near a wetland or a stream, if you're working near forest preserve or an area with rare plants. So we've talked a lot about how to be safe, and within the realm of the law when we're using herbicides. We're going to switch gears. A lot of the species I'm going to talk about today, in fact, all of them can be controlled with a foliar spray. So I just want to provide a little bit of background on that. To perform a foliar spray, what you would do is mix your herbicide following the label recommendations. And then you'll use a backpack or handheld sprayer to carefully apply the herbicide solution to the leaf surface. And when you're doing so, you want to spray until the leaf surface is wet, but not to the point of dripping off. So if you look at the pictures here, you can see that these leaves are getting nice and wet and coated in herbicide, but we're not spraying until there's pooling and ponding of leaves that's dripping off onto the soil. What are some helpful tips for when we are doing a foliar spray? The first thing we want to do is we want to avoid mixing surplus herbicide solution. So you only want to mix the amount of product that you intend to use. So if you have a backpack sprayer and you're just going to go spray a few plants, we don't want to mix that whole backpack sprayer. We want to make our best estimate. Once these herbicides are mixed, they begin to degrade in that mixture. So we don't want that excess herbicide mixture sitting on our shelf in our garage degrading. When that product's in the jug it comes in, it doesn't degrade. So only mix what you need. You can see the person in the picture here has their hand on the sprayer nozzle. So twisting that sprayer nozzle will adjust the size of the droplet. So we want to adjust the size of the droplet that's appropriate to the weather and what we're doing. So if it's a windier day, but it's still not too windy that we feel we can't apply herbicides, we may want to use a larger droplet size to control our drift. We always want to work from the inside of an infestation out, and this helps us avoid walking through treated areas and exposing ourselves unnecessarily to more herbicide. We can also use an indicator dye to track our progress. So a lot of these indicator dyes are blue, and you'll spray and you'll see blue, and you know you've treated that plant, so you don't come back and double treat it if it's a warm day and the herbicide's drying quickly. It also helps you avoid walking through areas that you've treated. I've talked a lot about treating during the optimal time. For most species, the optimum treatment time is going to be during peak flower and certainly before those species go to seed. So research your species and determine when that peak flower is so you can appropriately time your treatment. Next, we'll get into species identification and management. So the first species we're going to talk about today is common reedgrass or Phragmites. Phragmites is a tall herbaceous perennial grass. As Sean mentioned, this can actually get up to 15 feet tall. Thrives in wetlands and disturbed degraded soils. So today's training is targeted towards folks who work on the transportation right-of-way. When you think wetlands and disturbed right-of-ways, at least for me, roadside areas and ditches immediately come to mind. This is a very common roadside invasive. It's very commonly seen, especially if you're driving along the thruway or in certain sections of the Northway. The leaves of Phragmites are alternate, so the leaves are not directly across from each other. They're alternate on the stem. They're flat and hairless and come to a tapered point. They're about 20 inches long and have a pretty distinct blue-green color once your eye is keyed into it. The stems, when we look at the stem, the leaf sheath is going to be tightly attached to the stem. As you can see in this picture here, it's actually looping around that stem. You can also see a few fine white hairs here at the ligule. So the ligule is where that leaf attaches to the stem. Remember that word is going to come back in a few minutes here. And those fine white hairs are one of the the diagnostic features to tell the difference between this species and a common lookalike that we're going to talk about in a few moments. The flowers and fruit of purple loosestrife are large feathery plumes. So these are going to be a purple-brown color about this time of year as they start to form. They will fade to a tan gray late in the season, and that seed head will persist on the plant throughout the winter. How does this guy spread? The main way this spreads is through an expansion of its extensive underground root system. So these guys get root trailers, like if you grow strawberries, that help it spread. The main way it's spread through human-mediated change is going to be through fragmentation. So a piece of Phragmites as small as 1 inch can cause a new plant. So if you come through a Phragmites infestation with a mower, each one of those stem fragments can form a new plant, and you can risk spreading that plant along the right of way. The same fragmentation happens during flooding events on rivers. Phragmites can also be spread by airborne seeds. Phragmites is native to Europe and Asia, so this is just a map showing just some global occurrences of the species, and you can see that high density of plants that have been reported in Europe. And lookalikes. The first lookalike we'll talk about is another invasive plant called reed canary grass. They do look very, very similar. However, reed canary grass is smaller. It usually only reaches about 5 feet tall. And if you're ever curious, you can pull that leaf back and you'll see that that ligule, or that area where the leaf attaches to the stem, is membranous, and it lacks those white hairs that we saw on the Phragmites. We do also have a native Phragmites. However, that species is pretty rare, so it'd be unlikely that you'd see it, but it can happen. One way to tell is it doesn't form those dense monocultures, so stems of this plant are going to be less scattered in distribution. The other way you can tell is by looking at that ligule. So the non-native or invasive Phragmites you can see in this picture has a very faint or thin black line at the ligule. It looks like you drew it with a pencil. However, on the native Phragmites, it looks like someone took a Sharpie and drew that line. So how can we manage Phragmites? So if we have a very small infestation, only a few stems, we can dig those out, but we do want to be sure to remove that entire root system. Remember, new stems can pop up from that root system. We'll want to take any plant or soil material, contaminated soil material that we remove, and put it in a black contractor bag and solarize it like Sean said. So we're going to leave it in the sun for 2 or 3 weeks until it gets ooey gooey, and then we're going to dispose of it in our normal trash system. So put it out at the curb or take it to the transfer station. If you have access to heavy equipment, we can also use excavation as a treatment method here. So if we're using excavation as a treatment method, we want to be sure to excavate below the depth of the roots, which is usually about 4 feet. Then we want to find where the edge of those roots are, which may not be the same as where we're seeing above ground stems. And we want to create a 5-foot buffer around that area and remove all that soil as well. We should then bury the contaminated soil and plant material at least 5 feet deep. And then we want to monitor that area for several years to ensure that no resprouts are occurring. If any resprouts do occur, we want to treat those in a timely manner before the infestation can become established again. For each of the species I'm going to talk about today, I'm going to list some products and some recommended dilution rates. Remember, these are just generalities and what many products recommend, but you always want to check the product label of the specific product that you're using. The product label is the law in New York State. I do also want to mention that sometimes there is something called the 2EE, where an addendum essentially to the label has been made to allow for treatment of certain species that are not on the manufacturer label. So that's something else you want to check when you're looking for these dilution rates. So for Phragmites in general, we can use glyphosate at about a 1% volume to volume dilution rate. Again, check the label. The label's long. I'm going to sound like a broken record today. As a pure-based products usually recommend 2 to 3 pints per acre to treat Phragmites. Phragmites can also be treated via stem injection, where we use a stem injection gun to inject herbicide directly into the stem. Many glyphosate-based products recommend 5 milliliters per stem at a 50% volume to volume dilution rate. And it's really important, folks, to remember that this species does spread via fragmentation, so mowing is not a viable management option here. The next species that we're going to talk about is knotweed. So knotweed is actually, when I talk about knotweed, I'm actually talking about 3 species. We have Japanese knotweed, giant knotweed, and Bohemian knotweed. Bohemian knotweed is a hybrid of giant and Japanese knotweed. All 3 of these species are fast-growing herbaceous perennial shrubs. The leaves of Phragmites are going to vary in size between species. So Japanese knotweed is going to be have a length of about 6 inches, where giant knotweed is going to have a length of 12 inches, and Bohemian knotweed is going to have a length of about 9 inches, which is directly between those two. Remember, it's a hybrid. These leaves are going to be alternate on the stems. If you see the picture here, they're not directly across from each other. They're very leathery in texture, and they can vary in shape from broadly ovate to more heart-shaped, depending on species. I have oftentimes heard people refer to knotweed as Adirondack bamboo. I get a lot of calls from folks saying I have bamboo growing in my yard, and this is often the species they're talking about. When you look at these stems, they're very, very bamboo-like. So they are jointed and hollow, they're pale green in color with purple splotches, and they arise from spreading rhizomes or roots. Stem fragments do aid in plant dispersal here, just like Phragmites. A chunk of stem of knotweed that has a node in it as small as a centimeter can form a new plant. These stems will turn reddish brown in winter, and the dormant stems are visible throughout the winter into the next growing season. For all the bad that we can say about Japanese knotweed, it does have these really, really pretty cascade of white flowers that are a late flower for us. These flowers will bloom in August and September here in the Adirondacks. So from the pretty part of knotweed into the really scary part. So the roots or rhizomes of knotweed are going to be brown with an orange interior, as you can see in the picture here. You can kind of see that interior on the left side where it's broken. And I like to give the iceberg analogy here. So these roots and rhizomes may account for 2/3 of the biomass of the plant. So you see this big, tall, 12-foot tall plant growing, and just think about how much biomass is above ground. 2/3 of the biomass of that plant is below ground, and that's incredible to think about. These roots and rhizomes may extend up to 40 feet from where we see plants above ground. So really important to take into consideration as we think about management and excavation work near this plant. So how does knotweed spread? I'm looking at this picture and laughing because I'm realizing Sean and I chose to use the same picture. This species really spreads by the expansion of the underground root system. Remember, those roots can be 40 feet from where we're seeing them above ground. And as I mentioned, fragmentation is the main way this spreads due to people-driven drive changes, and also big flooding events like we've been seeing in the Adirondacks the past few weeks. So segments as small as 1 centimeter can form new infestation. So it's really important to think about as we're conducting our management and working in areas with this plant. As we can assume from the name Japanese knotweed, the native range of this species is Asia. So this is just an occurrence map showing some global occurrences of knotweed species in their native range. And what are some lookalikes? The first lookalike is another invasive non-native plant called bindweed. Bindweed, however, is a vine as opposed to a perennial or a bamboo-like plant as we're seeing here. However, the leaves are very, very similarly shaped. But if you look at them, the leaves of bindweed are more deeply heart-shaped. This is a common lookalike that we see, especially early in the season when knotweed plants are small. Another common lookalike that we see when knotweed is small is rough horsetail. This is a native species, but it does look pretty bamboo-like, as we can see here. However, this plant only gets to about 1.5 feet, 2 feet tall. And if we look at the top of it, we'll see a yellow spore-bearing body. So how do we manage knotweed? For very small infestations, we can dig or pull them. We always want to be sure to remove that entire root system, and we want to look around for that root system. As I said, this root system can be quite extensive. We then want to take the plant material as well as any contaminated soil, put it in a contractor bag and solarize it before disposing of it properly. Much like Phragmites, excavation is also an option here. So we want to excavate below the depths of the roots, again, at least 4 feet. Then we want to find the edge of those roots and rhizomes and create a 5-foot buffer, excavate all of that material, and then bury all of that contaminated soil and plant material at least 5 feet deep, being sure to monitor and treat any re-sprouts. We have 2 options for treating knotweed chemically. We can use either a foliar spray or stem injection. So most glyphosate-based products will recommend a 3% dilution rate. We can use that with or without a 0.5% of imazapyr. Again, check your product label. We can also use a glyphosate product as a stem injection. Most labels recommend 2 to 5 milliliters per stem at 100% dilution rate. So no dilution actually. Important to think about here, again, sounding like a broken record, this species does spread via fragmentation, so we never want to use mowing as a treatment option here. The next species I'll talk about is purple loosestrife. Purple loosestrife is an erect herbaceous perennial, grows 3 to 7 feet tall in a variety of wet habitats, including wet meadows, marshes, riverbanks, and the edges of ponds and reservoirs. Pretty common roadside invasive species that we see quite often. So getting into the diagnostic features, we can look at the leaves of purple loosestrife. They're either going to be directly across from each other or in these whorls of 3 that we can see in this picture here. The leaf edges are going to be smooth and not toothed, and the leaves may clasp the stem as we can see in the picture here. Kind of a cool diagnostic trait here is that the leaf veins do not touch the edge of the leaf, so there's actually a vein that runs parallel to the leaf edge. My absolute favorite trait of purple loosestrife is that its stem is square. So most plants, when you pick them up, they roll along in your fingers like a pencil. This doesn't. Its stem is very, very angular once you have it, and it kind of chunks along if you try to roll it in your fingers. Small stems may shoot out from the previous year's main stem, small stems may shoot out from the main stem above mature leaves. And previous year's stems will persist throughout the growing season into the following year. As we can see in this picture here, it's very clearly winter, and we can very clearly see that purple loosestrife still there. You can actually see a lot of the seeds on there getting ready to be knocked off by the next thing that comes along to knock them off. Purple loosestrife does have a showy magenta flower that's easily identifiable from July and September, so purple loosestrife should just be starting to flower around. The flowers will have 5 to 7 petals. Those 5 to 7 petals are really important to remember as we talk about a lookalike in a few minutes here. And the flowers will grow in these flower spikes. This species is really spread via seeds. So a single purple loosestrife plant can produce up to 2.7 million seeds. So if you think about if you get one purple loosestrife plant, that next year, you have the potential for up to 2.7 million plants. So that's why it's really important to manage these things while they're small. The seeds are going to be very tiny, perfect for getting the treads of tires if you're working in an area with this plant present, and they will remain dormant in soil for several years. Purple loosestrife's native range is going to be Europe and Asia. So we can look at this map of global occurrences and really see that high density, especially in Europe. So what are some lookalikes? The most common lookalike we get emails and questions about is fireweed. Again, it has magenta flowers and a flower spike. However, if you look at the individual flowers on fireweed, it will only have 4 petals as opposed to the 5 to 7 that purple loosestrife has. Its leaves may also be toothed as opposed to the smooth leaves that we generally see on purple loosestrife. The other difference here is purple loosestrife is really a wetland plant. We see it in wet areas where fireweed, not firewood, sorry folks, is more common in dry areas. Another common lookalike we see is blue vervain. Blue vervain flowers are going to be very, very tiny, and they're more of a periwinkle blue color. This plant will have toothed edges, but it will occur in the same wet areas as purple loosestrife. To manage purple loosestrife, we can dig or pull small infestations. Again, we want to be sure to remove the entire root system. We want to take all of that plant material and put it in a contractor bag and solarize it for a few weeks before disposing of it in the trash system once it becomes goopy. We can cut or mow the species, but we want to be sure of our timing. So we want to cut this species down to ground level just prior to flowering. We never want to mow any invasive species when they're in seeds, because think about how your lawnmower works, right? It cuts the grass and it flails it around. So it's going to throw around those seeds. You can also get those seeds into the tires of your mower and spread that infestation. So we never want to mow an infestation when it's in seed. If possible, we're going to want to rake up and solarize that plant material that we've mowed. We also have chemical options here. So we can use a foliar spray treatment. We can use a glyphosate-based product at a 1.5% volume to volume dilution, or a triclosan-based product at a 2% dilution. I'm going to say it on every side, these are generalities. Please check your product label for the manufacturer's recommended dilution rates. Before we move on to our next species, I just want to talk a little bit about biological controls. So we're really, really fortunate in that there are biological controls out there and helping us for purple loosestrife. The main biological control that we'll encounter for purple loosestrife are these Gallelorusella beetles. New York State has been releasing these beetles for about 30 years now, and they are present throughout the region, and they do a really great job. The cool thing I like to tell people about biological controls is that they will never eliminate an invasive species. But what they do is they, remember when Sean said, there are two things that an invasive species has to do. It has to be non-native, so purple loosestrife's non-native, but it also has to cause environmental, economic, or human health harm. These biological controls will actually keep purple loosestrife numbers in check, so they keep them in a low enough number where it's not causing environmental harm. So we'll only see a few purple loosestrife sprag stems or plants in the population instead of that dense monoculture when these beetles are present. And the way these beetles work is they'll feed on the leaves, and they'll cause this window painting that you can see in this picture here. Some people also refer to as a shotgun splatter, and that damages the plant. So the plant has to spend time repairing that damage, and then it doesn't have the resources to go to flower and therefore to seed. So if you do encounter purple loosestrife and you see these beetles on it, don't manage them. We want to leave that plant in place for these beetles to feed and have habitat and grow and thrive and be able to spread. However, if it's an area where the Gallelorusella beetles have just gotten to and they don't have high enough numbers to keep that purple loosestrife population in check, you may just want to cut off the flower head and just give those plants a little bit of, or those insects a little bit of help. The next species we'll talk about is wild parsnip. It is wild parsnip season out there, folks. I have seen so much wild parsnip driving around the park in the last few weeks. It's crazy. So wild parsnip is an herbaceous perennial that grows 4 to 6 feet tall. They're very, very commonly found in disturbed areas. I see this in highway medians a lot, and right-of-ways, open fields, lawns, those sorts of disturbed areas. And as Sean mentioned, the species does have a sap that contains toxic chemicals that when you get them on your skin and your skin is subsequently exposed to UV radiation will cause serious burns and blisters. I will note that this sap is water soluble. So if you do accidentally get this sap on you, the very first thing you should do is wash it off with water. You should then cover that exposed skin with as many layers of clothes as you can and get yourselves indoors. You then want to try to stay out of UV radiation for the next 48 hours to protect yourself from getting those burns and blisters. So how do we identify our wild parsnip? Wild parsnip's leaves are fairly distinctive. They're compounds. There's multiple leaflets on a single leaf, and they have very sawtoothed edges. When you look at these leaves, they really look like large celery leaves. The stem of wild parsnip is going to be pretty non-distinct. It's branched, it's hollow, that's where that sap's contained, and it's going to be slightly grooved. And its flower, it is in flower right now, so its flowers are these umbels or flower clusters. You can remember umbels has the same root word as umbrella, so it kind of looks like an overturned umbrella. Each of these umbels are going to be 2 to 6 inches wide. And each flower within that umbel is going to have 5 yellow petals that are going to bloom from June to late August. As I said, wild parsnip is out there in bloom in force right now. Wild parsnip is going to be spread via seeds. So it does have these small, broad, oval, slightly ribbed seeds that will fall as we get into late August, September, and into the fall. Wild parsnip has quite a broad native range. It can be found natively in Europe, Asia, as well as Africa. And what are some lookalikes? The first lookalike I'll talk about is golden Alexander. So golden Alexander has leaves that are not celery-like. They're compound, but much less compound. They're many fewer leaflets. And it's a much smaller plant. So golden Alexander only grows to about 2 feet tall. Finally, golden Alexander blooms a lot sooner. So golden Alexander will be in bloom in May and into early June. So we don't really see these two species blooming at the same time. The other lookalike we have is cow parsnip. So cow parsnip is a native species. It's a native counterpart of the species. And it does have that same toxic sap. So the same precautions would apply if you're working in an area of cow parsnip. The biggest difference between these two species are the flowers. So the flowers are going to be white on cow parsnip and yellow on yellow parsnip. Wild parsnip, there we go. Too many colors and parsnips going on for me, folks. Sorry about that. And finally, the leaves are going to be more palm shaped. So if you look at that leaf in the bottom picture, or in the bottom of the picture, you'll see it's almost as wide as it is long, where the wild parsnip leaf is much more oblong in shape. So how do we manage wild parsnip? We can dig or pull small infestations. We don't need to get the entire root for this species, though. We just need to be sure to use a spade to cut the tap root. We're going to take that plant material and put it in a contractor bag and solarize it. PPE is going to be really important here for mechanical management, folks. Remember, the species does have that toxic sap. So if you do choose to mechanically manage the species, be sure to wear heavy plastic gloves, long sleeves, long pants, closed-toed shoes, and be sure to put on eye protection. We can also cut or mow this species. We want to cut it to ground level prior to flowering. If we're mowing, if you're a person who works in highway maintenance, you're going to be up in a cab on a large tractor conducting mowing. You don't need to worry about that sap getting on you. If you're a homeowner, you probably don't want to mow these plants once they get large on, your lawn tractor where you could get that sap on you. You never ever want to weed whack through this species. It's just a bad idea. You're going to flail that sap all around and risk getting it all over yourself in an uncontrolled manner. Like all other species we'll talk about, we never want to mow the species when it's in seed. We can foliar spray this species. In fact, I have some contractors out working today that are doing some work for our DEC partners to control this species on a property they own. We can use that foliar spray. Most glyphosate-based products will recommend a dilution rate of 1 to 2% volume to volume ratio. Most triclopyr products at that same dilution rate. Again, always check your product label. The label is the law in New York. We're getting down, folks. I think we've reached about the halfway point. I think we have about 3 or 4 species left. So the next species we'll talk about is Japanese stiltgrass. So Japanese stiltgrass is an annual grass that sprawls along the ground as it grows. It's especially well adapted to the low light conditions and can thrive in a variety of habitats, including woodlands, wetlands, fields, and roadsides. So this picture is actually taken at the first infestation of Japanese stiltgrass that we found in the Adirondacks. We'll talk about seed a bit later, but I want to talk a little bit about it here because this picture really highlights what's going on here. So this picture is taken in a small HOA, and someone was building a new house in this area. A contractor from outside of the area had a trailer here with equipment on it that was parked. And it seems like what we suspect happened is that the contractor is probably working in an area outside of the region with Japanese stiltgrass in it. They got some seeds onto the tires of either that trailer or the equipment on that trailer. That the mud that contained those seeds dried and the seeds fell off. And they were allowed to proliferate on this hillside or in this roadside area, causing this infestation. And I just give that example to highlight the importance of cleaning our equipment before moving it between sites, because we always risk spreading seeds when we don't do that step. So you look at this picture and you think, Becca, man, that leaf just looks like any other leaf I'm seeing out there. How do I know that this is Japanese stilt grass? And I agree with you. Grasses are really, really hard to identify, but this one actually has a great diagnostic trait. And that diagnostic trait is going to be that silvery, slightly off-center midrib that we see on this plant. It's diagnostic to this plant. So the leaves are pale green, narrow and lance-shaped, and they have that diagnostic silvery off-center midrib. These leaves are also going to be smooth in both directions. So if we take our finger and rub it along the top and the bottom of the leaf, it's going to be smooth in both directions. These leaves do produce seeds via flower and seed spike. That flower spike are going to be produced on slender stalks in late summer, giving way to seeds in early autumn. So I have found in our area, we start to see these flower spikes in late August, and we're really seeing seeds set in September. Seeds here are that primary spread mechanism. Getting into our native range, the native range of this species is Asia, as we can infer from the name. And what are some Japanese stiltgrass lookalikes? So the most common lookalike are our native whitegrass or cutgrass. It has a very, very similar growth form. However, it does lack that silvery midrib. A lot of our native grasses do really look like stiltgrass. However, they don't have that smooth texture. If you rub a native grass in most of our native grasses in one direction or the other, there are going to be some fine hairs that give it a rough texture. To control Japanese stiltgrass, small infestations can be pulled or dug. You do want to be sure to remove the entire root system here and place all of that plant matter in a contractor bag and solarize it. Cutting is also an option here. It's very important to time it correctly for the species. If you don't time it correctly, it's very likely that the species will be able to go to seed. So we want to wait just before it starts flowering. So maybe when we see a few stems start flowering, we want to cut that back to ground level, and that will stop it from going to seed. We never want to mow when it's in seed, and if possible, we do want to bag and solarize that cut or mowed material. We can foliar spray this species. Most products would recommend a 1% dilution of glyphosate, or we can use something like a claim that it's a grass-specific product. However, the rate's going to depend on the size, so you want to check that product label. The next species we're going to talk about is small carpet grass, and this is kind of a fun one. We don't actually have small carpet grass in our region yet, but it is starting to cause problems in both the lower Hudson region and the Capital region. So I wanted to put it on folks' radar, so if you're working in one of those regions and you see this, be extra sure to clean your equipment. So small carpet grass is an annual low-growing and sprawling grass. It grows about 1 to 2 feet tall. It thrives in habitats with wet soils and direct sunlight, so perfect roadside ditch species. Some other habitats where we'll find it are wet meadows, riparian areas, and along water bodies. The leaves are going to be bright green in color, broad and cylindrical, and they are going to clasp the stem, as we can see in this picture here. The leaves do have fine hairs around the edges or the margins. And those leaves are going to grow to be about 1 to 3 inches long and about 1/2 inch wide. The base of the leaves are going to be heart-shaped and encircle the stem, as I mentioned, and they are going to have that membranous ligule. Remember, the ligule is where the leaf attaches to the stem. The stems are going to be smooth and slender and branched. They're going to have many jointed nodes. The stems are going to grow and spread horizontally with the ends facing upward. So the flowers are green, purple in color. The flower spikes are going to be 1 to 3 inches in length. And they're going to be in these tight spiked arrangements with up to 10 individual spikes. They are going to emerge in late summer, early fall. I've not personally seen this species yet, so I can't give specifics for the Adirondacks. But their fruits are going to be these oblong yellow-green seed pods. And seeds, much like many other grasses, are going to be the primary spread vector here. Small carpet grass actually has kind of an interesting native range when I looked into it. So the native range here is actually Europe, Asia, Australia, and Africa. I found a lot of information about controlling this species from Australia. We have a lot of invasive species here, and not a lot of them come from Australia, so that was kind of fun to learn. And that's just because we have vastly different habitat and climate here than we have in Australia. Some common lookalikes, the most common lookalike we're going to see is our native deer tongue grasses. However, the leaves here are going to be more land-shaped, and the entire leaf is going to be covered in stiff hairs as opposed to just some fine hairs along the leaf edges. Japanese stiltgrass, which is another non-native, in fact, we just talked about it about 5 minutes ago, is another lookalike. However, Japanese stiltgrass does have that silvery off-center midrib that this species does not. To manage small carpet grass, we can dig or pull small infestations prior to seed set, being sure to remove the entire root system and place all of that plant material and any contaminated soil into a black contractor bag before leaving in the sun for a few weeks to solarize and disposing it in our trash stream. We can cut it to a ground level at flowering. As a management option, again, never mow when it's in seed. If possible, rake up that plant material and dispose of it, solarize it and dispose of it. There are some products labeled for foliar spray here, so some glyphosate products recommended 2 to 3% volume to volume dilution. Again, check your product label. And there is a Quizzoloff-based product as well that is labeled for the treatment of this plant. So we've done it, folks. We've gotten to our last species we're going to talk about today. We're going to switch gears a little bit. We've talked about a bunch of plants, and now I'm going to take a minute and talk about an insect. So spotted lanternfly is a plant hopper that can feed on more than 70 host species. And it poses a pretty significant threat to our agricultural industry, especially grapes and hops. So if you enjoy an evening beverage of wine or beer, this should be something that concerns you. Tree of Heaven which is another invasive species. Sean talked about that species briefly. If you want to learn more, I encourage you to visit our website or check out, I believe when we gave this training last year, we talked about Tree of Heaven. Tree of Heaven, that invasive species is the preferred host of late-stage nymph instars to mid-stage adults of spotted lanternfly. So the nymphs of spotted lanternfly go through multiple instars or stages. And the first 3 of those instars are going to be black with white spots and range in size from 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch long. You can see what those look like on the left. The 4th instar turns a red color with white spots, and it's approximately 3/4 of an inch long. Nymphs are going to be present from May to September. I have been tuning into some calls around the state, and they're actually seeing adults in areas where we have spotted lanternfly. We don't have spotted lanternfly to our knowledge yet here in the Adirondacks, about 3 weeks earlier than we had in the past. So the adults are actually already present. Adults are going to be about 1 inch long and about 1/2 inch wide. They're actually a really pretty insect. So the forewings are pinkish tan in color with black spots. And the hind wings are red, black and red with a white band in between. The abdomen's going to be yellow with black bands, and the adults are going to be present from July to December. As I mentioned, we're seeing those earlier this year. What's really scary here are these egg masses. So females lay these grayish brown egg masses on any hard surface from September until the first killing freeze. So the question is, we're seeing adults 3 weeks earlier this year. Will we also see egg masses 3 weeks earlier this year? And when I say any hard surface, I mean any hard surface. So boat trailers, RVs, any equipment that's heavy equipment that's staged in an area where spotted lanternfly is present could have these egg masses on them. The egg masses will be covered with a creamy white substance that turns dark brown as it hardens. It almost looks like a splatter of concrete to me when I look at it. So what's the impact of these? So large swarms of insects can damage crops. Like I already mentioned, grapes and hops are 2 that we like to talk about. The insects will use their piercing, sucking mouth parts to feed directly on the phloem layer of the plant. This weakens the plant, leaving exposed to other diseases. And the insects also produce a sticky honeydew that can form sooty mold. I wish I had included a picture of what that sooty mold looks like because it's really disgusting. As I mentioned, those cryptic egg masses can be unintentionally moved by people on vehicles, outdoor gear, RVs. You know, they even tell people to check their camp chairs. These egg masses really can be found anywhere. Prevention is really our best management option here. So if you're moving equipment into the region, from the region of the state, or outside of the state where this insect is present, always check for those egg masses before moving something here. Spotted lanternflies native ranges Asia, as we can see here on this map of global occurrences. And what are some lookalikes? The first lookalike we have is pink underwing. Pink underwing does have a, kind of a pretty pinkish tan color on it as well. However, its body is brown as opposed to yellow and black. There are no spots on the forewings. And remember, spotted lanternfly is like a plant hopper, so it has those really big, long legs that these pink underwings lack. Spongy moth, another non-native species formerly known as gypsy moth, is another lookalike. When I talk about a lookalike here, I'm talking about the egg masses. They do have kind of similar looking egg masses. However, the egg masses of spongy moth are going to be spongy, as we can infer from their name, and fuzzy in texture, where the spotted lanternfly egg masses are going to be more waxy. Spotted lanternfly egg masses are also going to be darker in color than spongy moth egg masses. So we only talked about, I think, 6 or 7 species today, but there are a lot more invasive species out there to learn about. I highly encourage you to visit our website, adkinvasives.com, to learn more about the invasive species threats to the Adirondacks. Or if you're calling in from outside the region, please visit the website of the PRISM in your region to see what invasive species you should be considering. Any webinar that we've given since the pandemic started has been recorded and is available on our website to watch. So you can head to our website, click on the resources tab, and in our library, you can link to a list of all of our recorded webinars if you want to learn more. If you want to learn more about control methods, we do have a really great invasive species management practices guides available on our website, or you can also reach out to myself or Sean after the webinar. We can share a link to that with you. And there's just a plethora of great resources on our website in the resource tab if you want to check that out. Finally, we can't give an invasive species talk without talking about what you should do if you find an invasive species. If you find an invasive species, please enter your findings into IMAP invasives. It's really quick and easy to do, and these findings and these observations get put into a database, and folks from around the state will confirm your observation, and then those confirmed observations can be used to determine the extent of these species. Those extent determinations can help us determine where's our best option to treat and help drive management objectives. So IMAP Invasive is a mobile app that you can download onto your phone, and it's really easy to log in observations. So once you have the app downloaded and you have your app set up, and if you need help doing that, there's a great recorded workshop on our website. You can also visit the IMAP Invasives New York website, and they have gobs and gobs of great resources there to help you get the app set up and installed. But once it is installed, all you need to do is hit that green Add Observation button. The app is then going to prompt you to take a picture of the plant or insect in question. Taking a good picture is really important because that's how we're going to confirm it. So I'm going to ask you what species you found. And you can also log non-detections here. So non-detections are sometimes just as handy because then we know someone was there and that invasive species is not there. And then the date, and that's as simple as that. You can use the app without cell phone service. And then when you get home and you're on your Wi-Fi, you can just upload your observation. Again, more information on that, please visit our website. There's a great recorded, I think, 1.5 or 2 hour webinar going into a lot of detail about IMAP invasives. So finally, again, today's webinar has been offered for 1.5 credits in categories 3A, 6A, 9, and 10. To receive credits, you must have been with us through this entire webinar. You must also complete a 10-question evaluation within 2 business days. So that quiz will close at about 11:30, 12 o'clock on Saturday. So make sure you take the quiz before you head out for the weekend on Friday, folks. You are required to get a passing score of 70%, but unlimited attempts are allowed. Be sure to provide us with your address so we can mail your certificate. And the link for the quiz is right there on the screen, and Sean is going to drop that in chat with us. You do need to stay with us through the Q&A, but please feel free to copy and paste that link now if you need to. so you don't lose it. Sean will also send out an email to folks right after the webinar with that link again. A quick, sorry, I didn't expect that to be 2 clicks there. A quick shameless plug here for some upcoming events. You can always see upcoming events on our website at adkinvasive.com/events. In a few weeks here, we're going to kick off the summer portion of our Forest Pest Hunters program that Sean talked about earlier. So if you want to join us in surveying for beech leaf disease, there will be a virtual training on August 2nd at 10 a.m. You'll hear from me, as well as our friend Mitch at IMAP and our friend Maria over at DEC, who's really studying the spread of this. We'll also be offering a Lake Protectors in-person training on August 8th in Long Lake, and my colleague Brian will be leading that training from 1 to 3:30 on August 8th. So without further ado, do folks have any questions? Sean, have we had anything in chat?
Yes, we do have a couple of questions in chat. Let me bring that up here. Okay. For management of Phragmites, does the highway department use or has it considered using mats?
Not to my knowledge, and I'm actually not sure how well that management option works for Phragmites, just because of those extensive rhizomes. A lot of the rhizome species, I know a lot of folks who have tried that method for knotweed. Those rhizomes are great at spreading out. You know, like we said, they're 40 feet from where we see the plant. They can just kind of pop up on the edges of the mats.
And we have another one from Charles. How does one wash off mowing tractors out on the roadside edge?
That's a great question. So when we talk about washing, we often think about water, but we can also use compressed air. So a lot of times you may have access to an air compressor with one of those handy trigger nozzles, and you can blow off any plant material or soil material. You can also use stiff bristled brushes just to clean the treads of the tires and under the mower decks and that sort of thing. So there are options out there. And especially if you're on the right of way and you're going to go back to the highway garage or the residency facility, you can take care of that there, being sure that you're monitoring that facility where you're performing your regular washings for the pop-up invasive species.
Yeah, just a reminder for everyone, the link to the quiz is in the chat there. You can open up the chat box and see that. Becca, those are all the questions we had in the chat.
Yeah, if anyone has any other questions, you're welcome to come off mute or throw them in chat. And if we don't have any more questions, I guess we'll let folks go a few minutes early today. Thanks everyone for joining us. I hope you learned something. Sean, so usually all of our webinars are recorded. This webinar has been recorded. However, we cannot share that recording with you until all of the folks who are taking today's webinar for pesticide credits have completed their quiz. So Sean, do you think it'll go out Saturday or Monday, the recording of this webinar?
Probably Monday, although
Okay.
you know, on YouTube, I do think I could schedule it. So if I can schedule it, I'll do it Saturday morning, but if not, it'll be Monday at the latest.
Okay, so folks, I guess Monday, it sounds like, keep an eye out for an email from Sean or myself, and there will be a link to the recording of this webinar if you want to go back and review anything. Thank you, folks.
Yeah, thank you. Have a good day, everyone.